But first off, I do want to say, honestly, thank you, Danny, very much for having me. It is an absolute pleasure to be here. And I also want to say a huge thank you to each and every one of you for being here, because it is such an important topic that we're here to discuss. The lies that can kill a man's dream. And what I'd say is actually the lies that unfortunately so often do kill a man's dream. So we're going to talk about that idea today, but I also want to contrast it with a different one. I want to contrast the lies that can kill a man's dream with the vision that God has for your life. And I want you to notice the words that I used there, because I didn't say the vision that God might have for your life. I didn't say the vision that God could have for your life. I said the vision that God has for your life. It's an absolute, it's a promise that God has a vision for your life. So to start out today, I want to share a story. And the story begins with one of my favorite stats in sports, and it ties into a broader story about one of my favorite athletes. In the National Basketball Association, there is a 50-40-90 club. It's where over the course of an entire season, a player makes 50% of their shots from the field. They make 40% of their shots from behind the three-point line, and they make 90% of their shots from the free throw line. It is an absolutely incredible accomplishment. It's actually only been done 14 times in the history of the NBA, and not even by 14 unique players. In the 2015-2016 season, Steph Curry became the 10th member to ever join the 50-40-90 club. And he was the very first 50-40-90 club member to ever lead the league in scoring. Almost 50% of his shots that year came from behind the three-point line. So it wasn't just an incredible display of accuracy that season. It was an incredible display of accuracy from distance, with more volume than what we had ever seen before. And that volume of three-point shots made actually drove him to win the scoring title that year. If we fast forward 10 years from that historic season, Steph Curry is now widely considered to be one of the greatest players to ever play the game of basketball. He's had multiple MVPs, multiple NBA championships, Finals MVP. They actually call it the Steph effect because of how much he's changed the game of basketball. Before Steph Curry came into the league, there was roughly 7,000 three-point shots taken over the course of a season. And there's now more than 35,000 three-point shots taken. It's because Steph Curry changed the game of basketball. And so a logical question you could be asking yourself right now is, why in the world is this guy standing up here talking about Steph Curry? Talking about his shooting prowess or the incredible career that he's had. And it's because there were lies told about him that could have and probably should have killed that man's dream. Before Steph Curry came into the league, he was a shooting guard for a small school called Davidson. And in the 2008 NCAA tournament, he put that small little school on the map with the best display of three-point shooting we had ever seen. He averaged 32 points a game and broke the record for most three-point shots made in a tournament, and he didn't even play in every game. So when he declared for the NBA draft, I think everybody in the basketball world thought there would be nothing but good things to say about Steph Curry. And then the leading scouting report came out. And I want to share with you just a few sound bites from that report. The scout said things like, Steph Curry lacks speed and athleticism. At 6'2", he's undersized for the shooting guard position and will be unable to defend at an NBA level. He looks for his own shot too often and rushes those shots. And the scouting report signed off by just saying A for effort. Now, what I love about this scouting report is that we actually know the end of the story. We know how great Steph Curry became. So on the surface, it seems like there's nothing but lies that were said about him. But that's what made the scouting report so great. And a number of teams passed on him because that scouting report was so believable. And those are the best kinds of lies. The best kinds of lies are the ones that are believable. They're these half-truths or these warped truths that actually, they stop us from doing the things that maybe we were meant to do. So let me illustrate quick from this scouting report for Steph Curry. Is Steph Curry the fastest or most athletic basketball player? No. But just because he isn't the fastest doesn't mean that his athletic gifts are any less. He is just as proficient, even though he's not the fastest player. Is he undersized? Yeah, at 6'2", he's smaller than the average NBA player. But that doesn't mean he's unable to defend at an NBA level. Just because one thing is true doesn't mean the next thing is true as well. And this next part of the scouting report is where the scout almost warped the perception of what is good. Does Steph Curry look for his own shot in a basketball game? For those of you who don't know, basketball is a game where your best players have to be your best players. If your best players aren't actively trying to look for and create their own shot, it actually doesn't do any benefit for your team, because your team isn't going to put up enough points, and it also has a downstream impact on your teammates. There's a metric in the NBA called gravity. It's the ability for one player to draw multiple defenders towards him. And Steph Curry, after more than 15 years in the league, is the #1 ranked player for gravity. So while this scout makes this statement that it's almost this selfish player who doesn't deserve to look for his own shot, in actuality, that's the exact reason why he would have been drafted, is to be able to create his own shot and make the game easier for his teammates. Probably my favorite part of this whole scouting report is this idea of A for effort. How in the world could a good work ethic be a bad thing? But that's how it came across. It came across as almost a guy that works hard but just isn't very good. And when you hear NBA players talk about what it's like to guard Steph Curry, they actually call it a nightmare, because he never stops moving without the ball. And if he gets the ball in his hands with just a split second of daylight, 50% of the time, it's in the basket. Now, we may not be Steph Curry. We may not be in the limelight, and we may not have scouting reports written about us. But I promise you there are lies being told about you every single day that are stopping you from doing the things that God intends for you to do. And in all likelihood, those lies are actually going to be the loudest in the arenas where God has a specific vision for your life. You know, maybe you're a husband, and in a moment of weakness, while you and your wife are getting into a small argument, it starts to escalate and you say something that you immediately regret. And as the remorse sets in, the lies start along with it. You hear things like, "You don't deserve her. How could she love somebody like you? She could do so much better. Maybe she already has." And if those lies aren't dealt with and treated as lies right from the onset, it can actually drive a wedge between you and your relationship. Maybe it stops you from seeking forgiveness, and it stops you from loving her the way that Christ loves the church, the vision that God has for you in that relationship. Maybe you're a father, and the one weekend that you have to travel for work just so happens to coincide with your son's baseball tournament or your daughter's dance recital. And you know, you want to be at every single important moment of their lives, but you have to provide for your family. So you go on that work trip, you get back to your hotel room that night, the first thing you do is you phone home to check in on your son or daughter. And the words that you hear on the other end of the line are essentially, "Where were you? Every other dad was there except for you." And the lies that start being played here are essentially, you're not an absentee father, but you were definitely absent there. You promised yourself you'd be at every important moment, and you failed. How come every other dad is able to provide for their family and be home on weekends? Why can't you? And you're left with this feeling of inadequacy. Maybe from a work perspective, you've been trying to grow your career. You've been upgrading your skills, your education, working so hard, waiting for that job to come up on the job board, and it finally arrives. You put your resume in, you go through the interview process, you get a phone call from the hiring manager, only to hear that you are in second place. Maybe you actually went through that same process of trying to grow your career, finding that job, putting your application in, and you hear nothing at all. You don't even know if they got your resume. And so in that first scenario, you start to think, "I'm just not quite good enough." And in the second scenario, you think, "I'm not enough." I thought I was hearing this voice from God telling me that I was made for more than this. And the lie that comes in is basically telling you that you're wrong. This is confirmation that you are not made for anything more. You should be thankful you have a job at all. And it's that type of lie that stops you from doing things that God maybe has intended for you to do. Maybe that first setback was just a trial, a testing of your faith. I think every single generation of man has had to go through some form of those types of lies. And we actually get the added benefit of living inside of a world with social media, where people post the very best moments of the very best days of their lives, and we're led to believe like it's normal. For me, I'm not a huge social media user, but I'll typically see these two different scenarios. The first is I'll see these men on these great golf trips. They're at some type of US Open destination with 8 of their friends, and I think, how do they get the time off work, the time away from their family? How do they have the financial resources to do it? How do they find 8 friends to go play golf down there? I can't even find 8 people to play golf with me here. And it actually makes me feel inadequate in some way. And the one that really gets me from a lie's perspective is I'll see these men who started these businesses in their 20s and into their 30s. By the time they're in their 30s or early 40s, they've actually sold off these businesses, and they're just given this incredible amount of freedom. And I'm sure there's some form of financial freedom associated with this, but the freedom I've always desired is the freedom with my time. I've wanted the ability to stay home and make my kids breakfast in the morning, or meet my wife for coffee in the middle of the day. And I've actually felt it on my heart to go out and try to start something, start some type of a business. But these men that have made it on these social media platforms where they're sharing all their stories, I think they're talented. They're the successful ones. They've got good ideas and good networks. I've got none of those things. And as I hear those lies, I have believed those lies over and over again, and it's actually stopped me from doing a lot of things that I believe God's intended for me to do. Now, I told you I wanted to contrast this idea around the lies that can kill a man's dream with the vision that God has for your life. And I want to start out with a proverb. Solomon said, "Where there is no vision, the people perish." And when Solomon said that, he could have been talking about his own kingdom. He could have been talking about how if a king doesn't have a vision for their people, for their safety or their security, their prosperity or their provision, then that kingdom will die. Solomon could have also been talking about it from a military perspective, where if a military leader doesn't have a vision for their soldiers going into battle, then those soldiers will die. And just like so many of Solomon's words, as true as they were when he wrote them, they're almost even more applicable in our lives today. Think about any organization you've ever worked for or worked with. And the organizations that don't have a strong sense of purpose or a strong vision, those are some of the unhealthiest organizations that we see. But the inverse is also true. When there is vision, when there is a strong sense of purpose within these organizations, these are the organizations that can thrive. One of my favorite examples of vision from a business perspective actually comes from Apple. Now, my earliest memories of Apple are essentially it being this lower tier desktop computer company. It looked different. It didn't have any fun games. The functionality was off. It was almost something that you had to own versus something you wanted to own, a tool versus a toy. And that is not the vision that we have of Apple today. And I think it's largely because of vision. In 1997, Apple actually brought back one of their co-founders, Steve Jobs, because they needed vision. And of all the describing words you could use for Steve Jobs, visionary is the one that I would choose for him. Because he pictured this world where essentially Apple products could be in everybody's home through every facet of the day. And if you think about our lives right now, we don't just work off of our Apple desktops. We close our Apple laptop at the end of the day. We grab our Apple iPhone and we go into our vehicle where it automatically connects to Apple CarPlay, where you listen to your Apple Music on the drive home. When you get home, you want to talk to a friend or a family member, so you FaceTime them. And it's almost as if that friend is sitting in the palm of your hand in your living room. At the end of the day, you want to relax, so you go and you turn on your Apple TV where you can rent, stream, or buy almost any piece of digital content imaginable. They actually call it the Apple ecosystem because you exist in their universe. And now Apple is arguably one of the most successful companies in the world. It trades off with a couple of different organizations as the highest market capitalization in the world, which means the most affluent company in the world. That's the power of vision. And if vision is so important for kingdoms or militaries or organizations, I promise you it is equally important for your life. And while you may not physically die without a vision, the light inside of you starts to go out. And so now a logical question you could be asking yourself is essentially, okay, I understand the importance of vision, but how do I know that God has vision? Well, I just told you my favorite business example of vision. Let me tell you my favorite biblical example of vision. And I'm going to bring you all the way back to Egypt, where God is working through his servant Moses to free the Israelites from Pharaoh. And there's been a number of plagues that have been sent on the Egyptians. And every time a plague comes, Pharaoh hardens his heart and says, no, I will not let your people go. And then God sends the penultimate plague. He tells Pharaoh that unless the people of Israel go, then the firstborn son in every single family in Egypt will die. Except for one condition. Anybody who trusts in the blood of the Lamb is going to be saved from death. And so the Israelites, trusting in God and trusting in the blood of the Lamb, they slaughter a lamb and they paint the door frames of their houses with the blood of the Lamb. And that night, the angel of death actually passes over the Israelite homes. That same angel of death goes through the Egyptian homes. And those families wake to find the firstborn son in their family has died. They say there was never more weeping or wailing in Egypt since that morning, and there's never been more weeping or wailing since. Because everybody who does not trust in the blood of the Lamb is going to experience death. And everybody who does trust in the blood of the Lamb gets to experience life. And if God can weave together a vision over the course of thousands of years to save all of humanity for an eternity, I promise you he can weave together a vision over the course of your life. And so your next logical question could be, okay, I understand that God has vision, but how do I know he's got a vision for me and my life? And I won't poll the audience, but I would say that's a question that every single one of us has probably had in our minds at some point. And I'm no different. When I began my working career, I was placed inside of a publicly traded company. And the team that I was working for had a relatively young leader. And not necessarily young in age, but I would say young in professional maturity. He knew that I was a Christian, and actually from almost the day I started, he decided to make sport of me because of my faith. And I had grown up in athletic environments, and so I was used to kind of a good-natured ribbing on it. But this happened day in and day out, and it really started to wear on me. I had no idea why this was happening to me here. And then one day, the tone started to change a little bit. My boss had just gotten back from a trip to Las Vegas, and he was sharing with everybody kind of the activities or the exploits that he had on his trip. And then the conversation turned towards me, and he said, of everything I just described, what would you participate in? And I essentially told him that I chose not to participate. So then the tone and the tactic shifted a little bit from there. And he said, I have an ultimatum for you. You have to choose one of these three types of sin. What would you choose? And the rules of the game were pretty simple. No one was ever going to find out, but I had to choose, and I wasn't allowed to leave until I picked. And when I decided not to play his game, his tone and his tactic changed just a little bit more. And in front of all of my peers, he started to accuse me of judging him and everybody else in our office. And I'm not typically somebody who's ever lost for words. But in this moment, I had no idea what to say. And then I had this Bible verse go through my mind. And I told him, all the ways of a man seem right to him, but the Lord ponders the heart. I don't judge you. What's right for you may not be right for me, and vice versa. And as soon as I shared this Bible verse with him, he had this almost stunned look on his face. He went back to his desk, and he never made fun of me again. That night, I was working late at the office, and I decided to write that Bible verse on this little yellow sticky note. All the ways of a man seem right to him, but the Lord ponders the heart. I put the sticky note on his desk, and I was nervous to leave it there. I was even more scared to show up to work the next day. because I had no idea what it was like to share scripture with somebody at work in a corporate environment. But when I showed up to work the next day, the sticky note was gone, and my boss never mentioned its existence. And this was right in the middle of one of the hardest parts of my professional life. When I joined that organization, I actually had ambitions of being a senior leader in this organization. And it wasn't just because I wanted status or title. It was because I wanted to have a positive impact on people around me. I thought that if I could grow within this company, my sphere of influence would start to expand, and I would have an opportunity to be Jesus to the people at work. But every single day, I was getting beaten down by lies. I was essentially being told, not here. You will never be successful here as long as you stand up for him. In fact, the sooner that you give him up, the sooner you're going to get everything else that you want. This conflict inside of me was honestly like a war. And it was hard for me to get up to go to work every day. And I promise you, it was like the light inside of me was starting to go out. And it was like this for the better part of a couple of years. And I was on vacation. I found myself down in Phoenix, Arizona, and I decided to go to church one Sunday. I went to a church called Christ Church of the Valley. And as I walked into the auditorium, I heard the title of the sermon. And it was called, "What Are You Working For?" And in this auditorium filled with thousands of people, it was like I was the only one there. Every single word in that message was like it was being spoken right into my heart. And I had this realization, and it seems so simple to me now, but it was essentially the Great Commission doesn't just apply to pastors or worship leaders or missionaries. It applies to every single person who calls Jesus Christ their Lord. That means no matter what you do, where you work, or what your profession is, you were called to lead people to Jesus. And as soon as I had that realization, I could actually feel this light coming back inside of me. I still had leadership on my mind. And I thought, I'm going to be so intentional about being a servant leader at work. That's going to be my way to imitate Christ. And I honed in on a few qualities or characteristics that I thought Jesus led with, and I wanted to exhibit the same. And as soon as I started displaying those characteristics, I started to be seen at work as an emerging leader. My portfolio started to expand. I got promoted. And the cycle actually repeated itself several times over just a few short years. And I found myself as a senior leader within this organization. The year was 2020, and our company changed overnight. We were deemed an essential service, but so many of our customers were not. And as our revenues fell, as a publicly traded company, we had to make some tough decisions. Every single senior leader in that company was given a list of names, people that were going to be exited from that organization unless somebody put up their hand to save them. And as I saw that list, the very first name that I remember reading was my old boss's name. And while the world probably could have been thinking something along the lines of, what a good way to give this guy what he deserves, the thought that I had going through my mind was, what an incredible opportunity to give somebody what they do not deserve. What I get to experience every single day. Grace. What an awesome opportunity to actually live out my faith with works. Show this man forgiveness, that I keep no record of wrongs. And so I put up my hand and I said, I'll take him. And I did have a real business reason for bringing him into the group. But I'd be lying to you if I didn't tell you that the strongest voice I'd ever heard was telling me, you have to take him. And at that time, we were all on notice. Our jobs could change overnight. And so I booked a meeting with him. All of our meetings were virtual at the time. As he joined this meeting, he couldn't even bring his gaze to the computer screen. I remember thinking, does he feel shame, embarrassment? Is there fear there? Wondering how I was going to be treating him now that the shoe was on the other foot. And what happened next, I actually hope I never forget. Because the first words out of his mouth as he held up this little yellow sticky note were, all the ways of a man seem right to him, but the Lord ponders the heart. I've never forgotten it. And it was in that moment that I actually knew that God had a vision for my life, that I could be a light in a dark place. And I had this new realization. The realization was essentially that the world may not want you to talk about Jesus, but they love living beside somebody who lives their life the way that Jesus did. I told you before that we may not be Steph Curry, but some of you may have been made for noble purpose. Others of us were just made for common use. But the common denominator across us all is that we were made for a purpose, that God has a vision for our lives. And there's these incredible little breadcrumbs in his word that he gives to us. He says things like God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. What I didn't tell you at the start of the story is that I actually didn't even apply for that job. I intentionally said I was placed inside of this organization because I had randomly met a recruiter one day. Didn't know where they worked. We got to talking, and they asked for my resume. And this was back in the days when it was paper copy resumes, and I just so happened to be carrying one. I handed the resume over. I got a phone call a few days later. I got placed inside of this group for a job I'd never even heard of. I had no idea that God was working for my good at that time. Another verse is, he says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you, not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future." It doesn't say, "For I'm going to tell you all of the plans I have for you." He says, "For I know." If you're anything like me, I probably wouldn't even believe the plans he had for me if he were to tell me. I'm so grateful that he knows the plans. There was actually 7 years from the time that I wrote that little yellow sticky note to the time that it was being flashed up back in front of my face. And over the course of those 7 years, I had all kinds of lies being told to me nonstop about what I can and what I cannot do. I had no idea what I was working towards. And in one small moment, God almost made something crystal clear for me because he had good plans. And the last thing that I want to share with you is just, it's probably my favorite Bible verse right now. Exodus 14:14. It says, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still." And that is a verse that is so countercultural, especially for men. Because the world will tell you that you need to be a self-made man. The world will tell you that you need to design the vision for your life. And if you want something, go and grab it. And the Lord actually says the exact opposite. He says that the Lord will fight for you and you need only be still. And so as I close today, I just want to share with you two things. The first is I want to encourage you to know that God has a vision for your life. But you are going to hear all kinds of lies as you work towards that vision. And you're going to need constant vigilance to actually treat those and understand that they are lies. You need to know them for what they are. Because those lies are going to be the loudest in the arena where God has a vision for your life. And the second thing is, I'm so grateful for the opportunity to get to be up in front of you guys. If there's a message that resonates, I'd love to talk to you. I think at some point there may be some contact information that goes on the screen. But I'm just so passionate about this because it was so long that I had no idea what the vision was for me. And it's not this grandiose vision. But I'm so grateful that God has revealed, what he's doing in my life. So I so appreciate the time. Thank you very much, and God bless. What? I did not do one thing that Danny asked me to do, so while he's walking up on stage, I'll just share very quickly. He mentioned to me to talk about a book. I'll tell you that hopefully this year it gets published and released. And essentially the entire idea was, one day I had this idea around, I mentioned about servant leadership, mentioned about becoming a senior leader, and the whole idea around what I wanted to be and how I wanted to operate. And I thought, if I could be an executive at a company, that would be a great thing, just to be able to, that sphere of influence. And the idea that, it was not my idea, but that was placed inside of me, was essentially, what would it look like if the CEO of the business you worked for was a Christian executive officer? Not just a chief executive officer, but worked and operated with Christian principles. So that's what the book is going to be about, and a little bit about the journey inside of it. So, yeah.